younger people and sharing anecdotes, lessons for us to learn from. But today, this afternoon, we are listening to him right in the middle of a very brilliant and bright day. I guess the advantage is that nobody will be able to hide in the cover of darkness or to make comments that others cannot attribute to. So this fireplace is going to be a cross-generational conversation with Honorable Tundu Lissu. I know other people would want to know his other names. The ones that are normally famous here in Uganda are Tundu Lissu, but he's also called Antipas. For those who are biblical, you may probably remember something like that, and the other name is Mugwai. So Honorable Tundu Antipas Mugwai Lissu is going to speak to us this afternoon. His talk will be on constitutional legacies of Mwalimu Julius Nyerere and how those legacies affect Tanzania and Uganda. But before he comes, we have been generously supported, of course, with the Human Rights and Peace Center, Makerere University, which we are all aware of, but also the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Foundation. Allow me now to invite Anna Reisman from Konrad Adenauer to just speak to us and share some opening remarks that will set the ball rolling. Once she is done, I will then invite the president or the, what's the other phrase? You know, there have been constitutional changes to Makerere Law Society, chairperson Makerere Law Society, who is very well known to you, to come and moderate the session. So we'll start with Anna, and then we'll hand over to a more familiar face to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Unaweza. Good afternoon to all of you. We are very happy to be hosted today here at the Makerere University, at the School of Law, and we are very grateful to the Center for Human Rights and Peace for hosting us here today. My name is Anna Reisman, and I'm heading the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Uganda and South Sudan. It is to us always a pleasure to be on the grounds of a university. Universities are very special spaces, spaces for a critical debate, spaces for a critical exchange, spaces to learn and to question. So we are very happy to have all of you who are seated here, the students in front of me, that you have shown interest to come here together. And I believe that you will leave this room with a lot of knowledge that you will have gained just in a few hours being here. Again, I would especially like to appreciate the students and share with you that it is a privilege to be in auditoriums like this. It is a privilege to be exposed to different people and different conversations and different opinions around the world. This is what universities are for. This is what they offer to you. And so, again, thank you very much for hosting us. And Dr. Kubomas, thank you very much for your very personal engagement to have this conversation. Allow me to say Stiftung as a German political foundation. As a political foundation, we are in Germany affiliated to a certain political party, which are the Christian Democrats in Germany. Being affiliated to a political party, however, does not mean, number one, that we are somehow legally are the same entity. No, we are not. We are legally two very different entities. It also does not mean that there are financial flows between the political party in one direction or another. It is forbidden by law to do it in Germany, and it is forbidden for us, of course, to do it elsewhere in the world. What it means is that we share a certain ideology, we share certain values, we share networks. And as a political foundation working around the world, we of course also work with political parties around the world. And our today's speaker, Honorable Tundu Lissu, is the chairman of a political party in Tanzania that is called Chadema. And Chadema is our political partner in Tanzania that works with our office of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Tanzania. Honorable Tundu Lissu has been member of the Tanzanian parliament for 10 years, from 2010 to 2020. He has always been in very active politics. His activism in politics and his struggle, if I may use this word, for his country has almost cost him his life. This is a person who sits in front of you, who was rushed to a hospital in Kenya from Tanzania after having been shot at 16 times. 16 bullets in his body. The fact that he is seated today in front of us is a miracle. I personally often say that working for the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, I'm a blessed person. I come in contact and to work with incredible people around the world. People who fight for democracy, risking their lives. Because I find myself in a very privileged position to represent an institution whose mission it is to shape democracy worldwide. But let me be honest with you, I'm not the one at the forefront. I'm not the one risking my life, because I am not fighting in my own country for democracy. We shape democracy together as an institution throughout the world with people like Tundu Lissu. I have in front of me a book that is called Parliament and Accountability in East Africa. A book that Tundu Lissu has written while recovering in Europe from the attack on his life for his political work. And it is an honor that this book also has a logo of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung that worked together with Tundu Lissu to publish his work. So, Honorable Tundu Lissu, it's also always a privilege and honor for me to work with you together, as much as I'm, being a blessed person, can also say that it's not only a very professional and only a working relationship. But Tundu Lissu is not only a politician. Tundu Lissu, and I believe many of you here today are studying law. So he is one of you. He is a lawyer by profession. And he is also the former president of the Tanganyika Law Society in Tanzania. It is the Tanzanian Bar Association covering the mainland in Tanzania. And today's talk that he is going to have is exactly from the perspective of a politician, but also especially as a lawyer. His today's talk will address the constitutional legacies of Julius Nyerere in Tanzania and Uganda, because he has shaped and influenced them a lot. The way how the constitutions look like today, what Tundu Lissu refers to in this book in terms of how the parliaments work and their accountability in East Africa, a lot can be traced back to Julius Nyerere. And this will be the focus of our today's conversation. So once again, thank you to all of you for honoring our invitation today. Thank you once again to the Human Rights and Peace Center for having us here today. And now I believe I will directly hand over to Honorable Tundu. Sorry, and please come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna, for the invitation. Good afternoon, everyone. As earlier introduced, my name is Annie Maria Adikin, and I serve as President Makerere Law Society. And it's a pleasure. I'll be your moderator today. First of all, I'm very overwhelmed to be the moderator today after Anna told us of Honorable's legacy. It's an honor, and can we kindly give him a hand of applause? It's one thing to aspire to change the world and impact our countries in different ways, but it's another thing to be at the forefront. And I think our young people, especially here, need to hear that it's important to be at the forefront, at the fight for democracy. We look forward to listening to you, Honorable. And without further ado, I'd like to listen to you. The students would like to listen to you in this regard about the legacy of another great man in East Africa, Julius Nyerere. Could you kindly tell us how his legacy has shaped Tanzania's constitutionalism and Uganda?
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much for the generous introduction by both Anna and Annie. And thank you so very much for the invitation to come here. And thank you for turning up to come and listen to me. We should never, ever take for granted the academic freedoms which should always be the foundational stones for any university. You have invited me, and I'll tell you why this is very important. I am an alumni of the University of Dar es Salaam, or the Faculty of Law of the University of Dar es Salaam. But I can assure you, I cannot be invited I cannot be invited to the University of Dar es Salaam, to the School of Law nowadays, to speak on anything. So I don't take this invitation for granted at all, because freedoms, intellectual freedoms and basic freedoms generally, are a very scarce commodity in our countries nowadays. So thank you again for inviting me. I first came to Uganda and to this great university and to the then Faculty of Law, Makerere University, in early December of 1992. It was my very first trip out of Tanzania. I was a second-year law student from the Faculty of Law of the University of Dar es Salaam. That was more than 32 years ago. The occasion then was the East African Law Students Conference, organized and hosted by the Makerere University Law Society. And so, Madam President, Madam Chairperson, after a 32 years hiatus, I'm very happy to reconnect with the Faculty of Law, Makerere University again. Today, I return here 32 years later as the recently elected chairman of the largest opposition party in Tanzania and a political figure of some notoriety, if not in East Africa, certainly in Tanzania. Anna has told you of my trials and tribulations. It has been a very long and a very interesting 32 years, if you ask me. Please allow me to speak a little about this university. And I do this not because you don't know what this university is all about, but because we always need to remind ourselves of the traditions, of the great traditions that our universities represent for our countries and our societies. Makerere holds a very special distinction in the history of East African countries and societies that perhaps no other institution of higher learning in the region does. Growing up as I did in rural central Tanzania, where I was born and raised, the elders spoke of Makerere in hushed tones. When they said, "Huyu ametoka Makerere," this one comes from Makerere, it was a statement that needed no elaboration, and it demanded instant respect. To be associated with Makerere, set you apart from the crowd. The reason cannot be far-fetched. Makerere was the academic epicenter of the region. Coming here was the pinnacle of academic achievement, a testament to intellectual excellence. Makerere, this place, produced Uganda's first prime minister, as you may know, Ben Kiwanuka. It produced Uganda's first, third, and fourth presidents in the persons of Apollo Milton Obote, Professor Yusuf Chironde Lule, and Godfrey Binaisa. Makerere also produced Kenya's third president in the name of Emilio Mwai Kibaki. This institution also produced 2 of Tanzania's 6 presidents, including, more importantly, the subject of today's public lecture, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere. At the risk of offending the nationalist sensibility of my justifiably proud hosts, please allow me to venture to say that Mwalimu, as Nyerere is fondly called in Tanzania, Mwalimu is by far the most illustrious Makerere alumni of them all. But I should not get ahead of my story, because I need to speak about, to justify the subject of my lecture today. What is it about Mwalimu Julius Nyerere and Uganda? Speaking of Mwalimu in terms less than reverential and adulatory in Uganda carries considerable risks. It is especially so when the speaker is a prominent and controversial opposition politician known for his outspoken, no-holds-barred style. Ugandan Catholics, led by the First Family, have led a regional, perhaps continental effort to have Mwalimu canonized as a Roman Catholic saint. Yet, here I am to talk about Mwalimu, the great secular political leader and politician whose actual record as such leader and politician is perhaps points in the opposite direction to the Catholics' effort to make him a saint. You Ugandans may overwhelmingly view him as the Mkombozi who rid you of the hated Idi Amin Dada and his bloodthirsty regime, which had terrorized the nation for 8 long years. Yet, I'm here not only to celebrate that incredible feat of selflessness, but also to interrogate his other less savory legacies, which continue to torment not only us in Tanzania, but I suspect Ugandans as well. Whatever one thinks of him, Mwalimu towered over the politics of Tanzania and Uganda like the colossus he was. His influence in Kenya was no less significant, even if it is less celebrated. His long shadow continues to hover over our collective heads 4 decades after he left his presidential office and nearly a quarter century after his passing. So what is it that makes him this great figure, this figure that Catholics want to make a saint out of him? Allow me to start by talking about Mwalimu's Pan-Africanist legacies, because Mwalimu is perhaps more known for his work as a liberation leader for much of Southern Africa. He is more well known for his Pan-Africanist legacies than perhaps any other. Mwalimu's Pan-Africanist credentials have long been celebrated at home and abroad. He not only founded TANU, Tanganyika's independence movement, and led it to Tanganyika's independence in December of 1961. He inspired a host of other African nationalists to follow the same path. By the way, talking about inspiration to others, has any one of you here ever wondered why Kenya's leading nationalist movement, which was founded in May 1960, was named KANU? Tanganyika's was TANU, founded in July of '54. Kenya's nationalist movement, KANU, was founded in May of 1960. Why this similarity in names? Have you ever wondered why Zimbabwe's ZANU, founded in August of 1963, is named ZANU? Or Mozambique's MANU, Mozambique African National Union, founded in Mombasa in February of 1961. Have you thought of asking why Namibia's first independence movement was called SWANU, founded in September of 1959? All these nationalist movements were inspired by Mwalimu and his TANU. And many of these nationalist movements called Dar es Salaam their home in their early years. Dar es Salaam of the 60s and the 70s was the base for many of these parties. This is because when the Organization for Africa Unity, OAU, the forerunner to today's Africa Union, was founded in Addis Ababa in May of 1963, it chose Dar es Salaam and Tanzania as the headquarters of the OAU African Liberation Committee to coordinate the liberation struggles which were beginning to take off in much of Southern Africa. The first of Africa's political refugees to settle in Tanzania were therefore not Obote and fellow Ugandans who were kicked out by Idi Amin in 1971, but the Southern African exiles of the early 60s, such as ZANU's first president, Herbert Chitepo, who also happened to be Tanganyika's first African Director of Public Prosecutions. Mozambican exiles, such as Frelimo's first president, Eduardo Mondlane, and the second president, Samora Machel, also had their homes and bases in Dar es Salaam and in Tanzania, as was the case with leaders of SWANU and later SWAPO. When the frontline states were established following the collapse of Portuguese colonial rule in 1975, Mwalimu became the chairman of the frontline states, the position he held until he relinquished his political powers in 1985. So Mwalimu's Pan-Africanist credentials are very well established. What about his constitutional legacies, the subject of today's talk? While his Pan-Africanist legacies are well known and have been widely acknowledged, his contributions in Africa's constitutional development is less so, but it was no less significant. Mwalimu may rightly be described as one of the founding fathers, not only of the modern African nationhood, but also one of the progenitors of Africa's constitutional authoritarianism which has blighted the African political and constitutional landscape for decades. The authoritarian state that is personified by what Professor Okoth Ogendo, Kenya's leading constitutional scholar, called the imperial presidency, was largely created in East Africa by Mwalimu Nyerere. So while we know much about his Pan-Africanism, his contribution in the development of authoritarianism founded on the constitution of the state is well less known, but it is absolutely significant. Mwalimu took his cue from Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, his Pan-Africanist rival on the continent. He took his cue in the constitutional development of the continent from Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. And he developed the authoritarian constitutional order first in Tanzania and later exported it to the neighborhood, Uganda, and to some extent, Kenya. Starting with the Republican Constitution of Tanganyika of 1962, Mwalimu created the imperial presidency, which, as I've said, was very well described by Professor Hastings Okoth Ogendo in a 1993 paper. Mwalimu's republicanism led to the abolition of chiefdoms in Tanganyika, and I know, speaking in Uganda, how the issue of Uganda's kingdoms has been touchy all these years. He did not only destroy chiefdoms. Mwalimu's republicanism also subjugated parliament, creating what has been described as largely a rubber stamp, turning an institution which had been the most powerful institution of state at independence into an extension of his ruling party. Mwalimu's appetite for totalitarian control led to the disbanding of independent trade unionism in 1964, the dissolution of peasant cooperatives in 1966, to the suppression of multi-party democracy in 1965, and the state control of the economy after the Azimio la Arusha 1967, the suppression of independent press in 1969-70, and the dissolution of elected local government system in what was essentially an Orwellian decentralization policy in 1972. And soon after the dissolution of local governments, Mwalimu and his TANU embarked on what James Scott, a scholar of peasant societies, has described as, quote unquote, the largest forced resettlement scheme undertaken in independent Africa up to that time. By the time that resettlement scheme ended in 1977, over 9 million rural Tanzanians had been forcibly removed from their ancestral lands and relocated in Ujamaa villages, which were run by government-appointed managers. By this time, too, independent student unions in the country's sole university had also been suppressed, and their place was taken by the state-controlled student organization, which was run under the auspices of the sole ruling party then, TANU, and later CCM. And therefore, when we speak of Mwalimu and his constitutional legacy, first and foremost is the creation of this authoritarian Leviathan, the state which hovered over the life of the nation like no other. The state that had total control of the lives and livelihoods of the people of Tanzania. Now, at the top of that constitutional Leviathan was Mwalimu, the president. Under the constitution he created, Mwalimu literally became above the law, and he was accountable only to his God. He was not only the head of state, he was the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, he was the head of government, he was the appointing authority of all judges, of all members of various constitutional and statutory commissions. He appointed all heads of civil service departments, of government-owned state corporations, of institutions like the central bank and public universities. Until he left, Mwalimu was the chancellor of the University of Dar es Salaam. And the Constitution declared that all state employees who were not directly appointed by the president were deemed to have been appointed by him and certainly worked on his behalf, worked in his name, and he was the disciplinary authority of last resort. Over and above that, the president appointed all judges and justices of the country's Court of Appeal. He appointed them at his total discretion. He appointed at his discretion all members of the country's electoral commission. He appointed the clerk of the National Assembly, the chief executive officer of the National Assembly. He appointed a certain number of members of parliament. He appointed the central bank governor, and the list goes on and on. And therefore, when we speak of an imperial presidency created by Mwalimu, the president became what Professor Issa Shivji has described as the giver and taker of life, liberty, and livelihoods. He could decide who would live or die. He could pardon criminals. He could declare war. He owned the land. He owned the minerals. All the natural resources of the country. They were all placed in the hands of this constitutional Leviathan, and a Republican president, not an 18th century European absolute monarch. So that is the most important contribution of Mwalimu Julius Nyerere in the constitutional development of Tanganyika. All African countries which were formerly under British colonial rule, literally all of them, emerged from colonialism with constitutions which had a Bill of Rights. Not so Tanganyika. Mwalimu refused British attempts to introduce a Bill of Rights in Tanganyika's independence constitution. And he continued to resist the introduction of the Bill of Rights until 1984, a year before he stepped down as president. He always argued that we do not need a law that prescribes limits on the government. We should not create constitutional straitjackets. We should not introduce constitutional limits to the power of the government and the power of the president, because the state, in Mwalimu's view, was this benevolent institution whose mission was to bring development to the people. And therefore, he argued it should not be encumbered by a Bill of Rights. The courts should not be given the power to curtail the government's mission of bringing development to the country and the people. So by 1985, when he left office, the people of Tanzania were under the total control of the government, which prescribed every inch of their day-to-day lives. Growing up as a child, you only went to government school, a government primary school. You only went to a government hospital. You only went to a government secondary school. You shopped in a government-owned shop or in a Ujamaa village shop. You wore whatever shirt or shoes you got them from a government-controlled outlet. You only listened to Radio Tanzania Dar es Salaam. If you happen to be in towns such as Dar es Salaam, you only read government-owned Daily News or CCM-owned Uhuru newspapers. There was, beyond those two newspapers, there was nothing. There was no television, nothing. If you were employed either directly by the government or by a government-owned state corporation or by some other government-owned institution. And you did not negotiate your salary, it was prescribed for you by the government. Those were years when we were totally dependent. We became totally dependent on Mwalimu's state. You could not complain anywhere. There were no rights. There were no independent trade unions. There was no way of organizing independent of the government prescribed organizations. There were years of permanent shortages of everything from sugar and soap and everything that you take for granted when you go down to Wandegea to shop. Right? And it all came down from this monolithic state that Mwalimu created. Talking of our politics, of Mwalimu's politics, one of the most characteristic features of our politics under Mwalimu was something that you should know very well, being Ugandans: the militarization of politics and the politicization of the armed forces. I've been reading these past 2 days, I've been reading somewhere of a Ugandan professor, perhaps from this university, complaining that UPDF, Uganda People's Defense Forces, have someone called the political commissar. And that professor, the learned professor, alleges that there are only 2 countries in the world which have political commissars in their armed forces: Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's China. Well, with all due respect, the professor didn't have to travel to Russia or China to know about political commissars. From 1964, when the Tanzania People's Defense Force, TPDF, yours is called? UPDF, right? Where did you get UPDF from? From 1964, when Tanzania People's Defense Forces were established following the army mutiny of January 64, the Tanzanian armed forces have always been heavily politicized. Tanzania's armed forces have always been politicized. Tanzanian politics have always been militarized. It cannot come as a small wonder then that of Tanzania's 6 presidents, one, Jakaya Kikwete, was a very senior army officer. Of Tanzania's 6 or 7 prime ministers, 2 of them were very senior military officers. They include one chief justice who was a major general in TPDF. And that is to say nothing. That is to say nothing of possibly hundreds of senior army officers who have served in various capacities in politics and in civil administration as ministers, as regional commissioners, as district commissioners, as heads of government parastatals, and so on and so forth. So the phenomenon of militarization of Ugandan politics and the politicization of your UPDF, I dare say, have nothing to do with Putin or Xi Jinping. They have everything to do with Julius Nyerere and Tanzania. Where did Yoweri Museveni grow up? All of you know that he went to Dar es Salaam, to the University of Dar es Salaam. Very few of you know that he literally lived in Mwalimu's state house. What happens when Mama Maria Nyerere comes to town here? Mzee and his entire family come. He doesn't wear that big hat of his in Mama Maria's presence. He literally grew up under Mwalimu's wings. And all this revolutionary adventurism of his started in Tanzania. And therefore, you should not be surprised that your armed forces are Uganda People's Defense Force, like his beloved Tanzania People's Defense Forces. Now that is a direct Are we okay? The oversized role that your armed forces play in today's politics in Uganda, the almost wholly borrowed from Tanzania. And I suspect many of the generals here trained in Monduli outside Arusha. That is Mwalimu's legacy, his constitutional legacy for you. But it is not just that. Let's go back to the early 60s. When Uganda gets independence in 1962, in October of 1962, Tanganyika is only 2 months from becoming a republic. Mwalimu is in the process of carrying out a constitutional coup, changing the country's entire constitutional order from a parliamentary democracy he had inherited in 1961 at independence to a republican form of government with an executive president at its head. So Uganda gets independence when Tanganyika is becoming a republic with an imperial president. When Uganda gets independence, there is already in East Africa, there is already in Tanganyika, a ready model of governance which gives whoever is in power, whoever is in control of the instruments of state, real powers. Now you know, because you're here, you know that the constitutional settlement that was negotiated at Lancaster House made Uganda a federal state with kingdoms, with districts, and the territory of Mbale, right? Uganda's federalism was very well established in the constitution and entrenched. You could not change the federal character of the Ugandan state except with very high majorities. It made for a very complicated system of government. It made for political leaders who were severely constrained in their ability to deploy power. And because of Uganda's ethnic demographics and that complicated constitutional settlement, it was very difficult to change that system into a republican form of government with a kind of ease that had characterized the transformation of Tanganyika into a republic in 1962. So to transform Uganda into a republic with an executive president required a military coup by Milton Obote in 1966, in February of 1966. You should know this history, I hope. What is the constitutional order that Obote imposed? The so-called Pigeonhole Constitution of April 1966. If you look at the Pigeonhole Constitution and the Constitution of 1967, which was adopted a year later, one thing stands out: the imperial presidency. The imperial presidency that Mwalimu Nyerere had created for Tanganyika with the Republican Constitution in 1962. Milton Obote required the assistance of Uganda Army led by a colonel, later Brigadier Idi Amin, to create that Republican constitutional order with an executive president. The order that emerged out of that coup and the two constitutions was in all fundamental respects a reflection of the constitutional order that had ensued in Tanganyika after the Republican Constitution was adopted in 1962. Imperial president, a president who could appoint literally anybody of any consequence in Tanzania, in the country, in Uganda. And the same model was adopted when Idi Amin threw out Milton Obote in 1971. It was carried over into Yusuf Lule's government after Amin was kicked out with the Musaada wa Wakombozi from Mwalimu 1979. It was institutionalized again in Obote II. And who can say today, with Yoweri Museveni and your constitution of 1995, who can say that Uganda does not have an imperial president under the current constitution? All that, my argument is, all that was inspired by Julius Nyerere. And you know, he did not only inspire constitutional development in that direction, he also interfered massively in Uganda's internal political processes. Anyone doesn't know this? He did not only overthrow Idi Amin, he installed Professor Lule, and when Lule started acting too independently, he had him removed, all right, in Mwanza. You should read Professor George Kanyehamba's book on the constitutional development of Uganda. He tells the story of how Lule was removed. They were all summoned in Mwanza, and the deal was done. Interfered heavily in Uganda's internal politics. He paved the way for the return of Milton Obote II through the halfway house called Paulo Muwanga and his defense minister, one Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. So whatever you think of Milton Obote, whatever you think of what happened during those 5 painful years, from 1980 to 1985, to July 85, when Obote was once again thrown out by the army, you should never forget that Obote's return for the second time was engineered by Mwalimu Nyerere. And therefore, he bears a not small contribution in the torment that Uganda went through during those years. And he was also, as I said, the political father figure of your current president. The one thing that we should not blame Mwalimu for, I think, as I said, he was a great man. One of the things that testified to his greatness was his decision in 1985 to relinquish power voluntarily. Tanzania became the first country in Africa to successfully institute presidential term limits, the first on the continent. And it is thanks to him too. That it has not held in Uganda, it was tried, right? It was tried thanks to his inspiration. It was presidential term limits were instituted here, I argue, thanks to Mwalimu, to his inspiration, to his example. That they have not held. He should not be blamed for the fact that presidential term limits have not survived here. Maybe if we say that he contributed in a way because of the imperial presidency that he inspired here and elsewhere. But his introduction of presidential term limits has held in Tanzania and has been adopted in almost every other constitution you can think of in modern Africa. Even if in a few countries there has been a backsliding. So we can thank Mwalimu for presidential term limits, the constitutional legacy of Mwalimu. What else? What else? Mwalimu loved university. He loved intellectual debates at university. During his long tenure in office, Mwalimu encouraged academic freedoms at the country's sole university. He loved going to the university to battle it out with students and faculty. He allowed freedom nowhere else. You had no right to speak anywhere else but the university. If you go today to the University of Dar es Salaam today and to our universities beyond Dar es Salaam, that great tradition of academic freedom has been lost. Today, our universities have become jailhouses where academic freedom is imprisoned. Mwalimu let it flourish. And standing here today at Makerere, his alma mater, I urge you all to protect that one distinguishing factor that characterized Mwalimu and his university: intellectual and academic freedom. Fight to protect your right to speak, right to protect your academic freedoms here in this great university. So let me finish. Let me finish so that we may ask questions. What do we make then of Mwalimu? What do we make then of this great man? One, he was a man of his times. The period of the 1960s was a period of what scholars have described as dirigisme. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly. It was a period of state control of the commanding heights of the economy. It was a period of the state as a provider of social services, not just in Africa, but it started in Western Europe, and that is why Mwalimu counted as his close friends all Western social democrats, from Willy Brandt in Germany to Sweden's Olof Palme, and the British labor leaders of the period. So he was a man of his period, a man of his times. Number two, he could have made different choices. It was not a given that we should have taken the direction that Mwalimu took. Seretse Khama of Botswana, who led his country to independence in 1965, did not take that road. And today, people sing praises of Botswana as one of the few success stories. It is partly because Seretse Khama, the first president, did not choose the path that Mwalimu chose. He had choices. And he should be judged for choices that he made. Number three, he was a human being. He was fallible. There have been a huge investment in politics as well as in the church to canonize him, to make him either a political saint. If you are in Tanzania, Mwalimu is untouchable, or a religious saint, as in Saint Julius. There has been a massive investment to make Mwalimu a saint. Whether a secular political saint, or a religious saint, as in those efforts which started here with Ugandan Catholics. But Mwalimu, I believe, they are doing this because Mwalimu is no longer with us. Mwalimu would have been the first to admit that he was first and foremost a political leader. He was a devout Catholic, yes, but he never was a religious leader of any not. He was a political leader. And as such, political leader, he could sign death sentences, and he did sign several death sentences. He put people into detention without trial. He conducted war. We always talk of the Uganda War of 1979. Read Museveni's planting the mustard seed, and you will know that there were all kinds of troubles emanating from Mwalimu's Tanzania into Amin's Uganda. In fact, one of our regional police chiefs was killed inside Uganda, and he was not returned to Tanzania until after 1979. What business was the regional police commander doing deep inside Uganda in 1972? Mwalimu had a very activist foreign policy. He sent Tanzania's armed forces to overthrow governments in Seychelles, in Comoro. He had Tanzanian soldiers fighting in liberation wars in Mozambique and elsewhere. He was a very activist. He had a very activist foreign policy, like someone you know very well. Now, that's another legacy of him. He was first and foremost a political leader. He did not allow rights. He was not accountable to anyone. He was one of the most honest people you can imagine. He died a poor man. In fact, he died without a pension. Mwalimu got his pension statutorily provided in April of 1986, almost a year after he had relinquished presidential office. So he left office without a pension. He didn't steal. His family are paupers by Tanzania's recent standards. He's a very honest man. And there is a great value to be attached to that. But he created the constitutional and institutional incentives for the massive corruption that the country suffers from today. He created a system of government which was completely unaccountable to anyone. So that is Julius Kambarage Nyerere and his legacies for you. Thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you. Thank you.
Once again. Once again, Honorable, I'm at a loss for words, and it's just an honor to get to hear the full story. It's an honor to hear the full story of Julius Nyerere, and I think it's a call to question our political saints in this country, because we have a couple of them, the untouchables. As the session proceeds, I'd like to just remind you a bit of the program. We're going to have 2 more panelists, and then we shall open it up to you. So please skip the questions. I hope as Honorable was speaking, you are noting down a couple of them. And Honorable, I'd like to say that in light of your presentation here today, it's to give a bit of context. We're in the lecture season at the university, so all these freedoms you've been talking about, of students being at the center stage of some of the most pivotal conversations in constitutionalism in this country. In this room, you have activists who have stood face to face with some of the political...
Thank you very much, Annie. I think you're doing an incredible job. Well done. I'd like to thank Honorable Tundu Lissu for that very insightful discussion. And also to thank, of course, Anna and the team from CAS, Anna, Ale, Sam, and the rest of the incredible team from CAS for their support, without which this might have been a little bit more difficult. Professor Mbazira, the Principal Emeritus of School of Law, thank you so much for your presence. Unaweza, and other colleagues who are here from Huripec and School of Law, thank you so much. I start from where Honorable Lissu started, the idea of academic freedom and its importance. Today's discussion almost did not happen for a variety of reasons that I'm not quite at liberty to say. But let me say this. It's a very sad day if in a university a discussion of this nature cannot take place. It's a very sad day indeed. And if that doesn't happen, if that cannot happen at a university, then I think it's very difficult to call that institution a university. So for us really at the School of Law, and I would say Huripec, it's a continuing commitment to ensure that we continue to do what we can to ensure that Makerere University remains a university properly so-called. But I think it's important to also highlight the idea that that continued existence of academic freedom here and elsewhere is not inevitable. As Anna says, it must be struggled for consistently and constantly. And unfortunately, there has been a gradual diminution of freedom of expression within Uganda, and inevitably then also in Makerere. And my fear and my concern is how we have allowed this to happen, because the loss of freedom always happens incrementally. The famous Pastor Nimola statement about they first come for this, you say, I'm not a Catholic, they come for this, and before they come to you, it's too late, there's no one speak for you. I'll continue to remind Ugandans of what I consider to be the worst decision, one of the worst decisions ever in our constitutional history, the decision in Foxodoi. Now, for many Ugandans, it was a popular decision because it concerned a topic that is very controversial and concerning a group that many Ugandans don't like. But at page 164, paragraph 438 of that decision, the Constitutional Court of Uganda asserted that the purpose of one of the impugned sections, which they upheld, whose constitutionality they upheld, was, and I quote, to confine academic freedom to the academic setting so as to avert public disquiet and undue social upheaval, close quotes. The Constitutional Court is suggesting that, okay, this provision it's okay. You can restrict freedom, you can protect academic freedom as long as the speech only happens at a university. Now, that's a very strange idea. Do you stop being a teacher when you go out of the university? When you get out of the stage, do you suddenly transform? Do you lose that freedom? Or as a student, do you lose the freedom to speak because you have left the gates? If it's a virtual lecture, do you still, based on this reasoning, enjoy that freedom if you're not physical at Makerere? But the Constitutional Court also suggested that academic freedom is only protected as long as you're within the bounds of your expertise. That, of course, suggests that since some of the aspects today concern political theory and history, then perhaps Dr. Unaweza and I, and perhaps even our honorable guest, are not covered by that freedom according to its articulation by the court. Obviously very strange, very illogical, dangerous even propositions. But you see, they somehow went unheeded by the majority of us Ugandans because, well, it's a decision touching those people we don't like. But freedom is lost incrementally. And if it doesn't mean anything for those people we don't like, it means nothing for anyone. And my invitation to you all, to us all, okay, then it was about that, but you can see from some of the hints we are giving today that even that freedom within this university is under threat. So if one thought that you could preserve your freedom as long as you are in the gates of Makerere, evidently that may not always be the case. Okay, I think I'll leave it at that particular point. I had prepared a couple of rebuttals. I felt compelled to defend Nyerere and to offer some balance, and I had prepared a number of, I was going to be the advocate, not the devil's advocate, but the advocate of the saint. But unfortunately, Honorable Lissu's presentation was too balanced for me because he dealt even with the points I would have made to salvage or balance out the discussion. I had mentioned the frugality, the honesty of Mwalimu Julius Nyerere. Unfortunately, Honorable Lissu mentioned that. I had mentioned the fact that he left power peacefully in 1985, creating a precedent that has held for Tanzania to some extent and could have worked elsewhere. Again, very unfortunately, to my great discomfort, Honorable Lissu also covered that. So I'm at a bit of a loss. Let me just then make 4 quick points in terms of reflecting on some of the things that we have had. 1964 was a difficult year in East Africa because the mutiny that happened in Tanzania, Tanganyika, also happened in Uganda and happened in Kenya. I'd be quite interested to hear from Honorable Lissu the extent to which he feels that that overwhelming threat that was not just within Tanganyika but affected the broad range of ESC might have informed the greater militarization of Tanzania and, by extension, Uganda and Kenya. Certainly, 2 years after that is when we had the 66 invasion, and certainly, so because in Uganda you had a capitulation. Obote basically had negotiations with the army officers and gave in to most of their demands. Perhaps then they recognized their power, which was affirmed in 66 with the attack on the state. And then, of course, in 71, we see the soldiers deciding not to go through middlemen, but to take over power themselves. The second issue that I would personally look forward to Honorable Lissu reflecting upon or telling us his views about is the question of ethnicity. especially when you compare Tanzania with Botswana, the case of Botswana. Sir Seretse was dealing with a comparatively monolithic state as compared to Tanzania and, of course, Uganda and even Kenya. Is it possible that the choices Mwalimu Julius Nyerere made in terms of a centralized state, abolishing chiefdoms, and other policies that created an imperial presidency at the cost of subnational autonomy, is it possible that perhaps that was informed by the specific instances, the peculiarities of the Tanzanian state, especially when it came to the multiple ethnicities? The third point, and this is a point where I think it's interesting, Honorable Lissu referenced Kanyehamba's book, Constitutional Law and Government in Uganda, and I've always found a passage in that book very interesting. It's a discussion between Ugandan politicians taking place in the Tanzanian State House. And it's about Ugandan politics, but the debate is not happening in Parliament of Uganda, it's happening, they are performing for Nyerere. And they're making the arguments to him because, for all intents and purposes, he was the post-Idi Amin president of Uganda, for all intents and purposes. And Kanyehamba recounts, so Nyerere invited the various Ugandan politicians to speak. And Kanyehamba says when he gave his presentation, it was a long one and rather winding. Nyerere stopped him and said, "Are you a lawyer?" And Kanyehamba said, "Yes." And said, "Keep quiet, stop there, these are matters for politicians." It seems to me that perhaps as with many political scientists, certainly many here in Uganda, both within the scholarship but also within the leadership of the state, there seems to be a view of law as subordinate to politics. Law as subordinate to politics, that the politicians and the army, the soldiers, decide things, and then the law is made to fit that description. Perhaps that window, that brief anecdote that Kanyehamba tells us provides a window into this. The final point I'll make is, and again as the advocate for Mwalimu, is the East African community, which collapsed in 1977 because of a difference of values. It seems to me that, and of course it's on record that Mwalimu said he could not sit at a table with someone who had blood on his hands. He was referring there to Idi Amin. So that by the time the EAC collapsed in 77, that it was partly or mainly based on a difference of values that was irreconcilable. That you had a murderer in Uganda and a reasonable person, or more reasonable people, in Kenya and Tanzania. And that the collapse, therefore, was primarily about a difference in values. But sticking to the point of values, again, perhaps being fair to Mwalimu, is the 1972 invasion. And there has been a little bit of criticism of Mwalimu's interventionism outside Tanzania, but I suspect as Ugandans, 72, although it was a failed invasion, was an example of a neighbor trying to do the right thing for Uganda. And not many countries, to be honest, try to do the right thing. It collapsed, the invasion, sadly, and those who had attempted it, some of them were shot in public, as an example to others. My own maternal uncle, cousin to my mom, was among those shot in Barara in public. So there were wounds, I think, from 72. But the idea that you had a president who was willing, of a neighbor, who was willing to support an invasion, I think is a very interesting and a very powerful example of solidarity. I take the point then, of course, about 79. That may be a suggestion that perhaps what was the Tanzanian officer doing that maybe there was something there. But could it not be said for Mwalimu that at least at his core, that although he did not have a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, there was a Bill of Rights in practice to some extent, not only in Tanzania, but the Bill of Rights that was externalized to Uganda, the idea of the right to life, in large part the right to self-determination, the right to an extent, democracy even, or government, or good governance. We can talk about it in terms of degree. And as I sit, is that not what is failing the ESC right now? A failure of values. It seems there's a unity though. There seems to be a unity in terms of values, but the wrong ones. We have Ugandans being abducted in Kenya and sent back to Uganda in very strange circumstances. It is of course very sad that our most honored guest cannot, as he said, give this same speech in the University of Dar es Salaam, or at the Faculty of Law there. So it seems there's a unity of bad values, yes, but bad ones. But it's now a federation that is united in dictatorship, lack of human rights, and all the other isms you can think about. Maybe, if Mwalimu Nyerere were alive today, perhaps the 2005 amendment of term limits, perhaps the amendment, the continued desecration of term limits might have been forestalled. Maybe he would continue to exert, I was talking to Dr. Unaweza, maybe he would continue to exert a certain mentorship to say maybe, look, Mzee Yoweri, please maybe, perhaps go and relax as I did. Or maybe he might have invited the ESC to move towards better values. I'm looking forward to hear both from Honorable Lissu, my fellow panelists, but also you, what you think about these things. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Every single time we listen to you all over again, it's a lecture of constitutional history and constitutional law. So I'd like to hear from Dr. Unaweza on this same topic. Doctor, you're most welcome.
Thank you, Annie. I noticed that Kabumba is more popular. Because of the amount of clapping, and it seems some of us less known fellows, we can only ride on his popularity. Seriously though, I think maybe I speak for myself, but partly also for BK, as we normally call him, that we've been caught, is it caught flat-footed by the presentation by Honorable Lissu. Because for the longest time, we have held Mwalimu Julius Nyerere in the highest regard. Growing up, as we said, Honorable, growing up, we have only had good things to say about the powerful leader of East Africa. And so listening to your speech has gotten us shaken, at least gotten me shaken about what I can and cannot comment about. Because like you said, you started off very well and you built this powerful African leader who had done great things for the continent, and then you brought the conversation back home. And that is when I didn't know what to write anymore. Maybe what I could start by saying is I do agree with you that first of all, conversations like these ones are important. They're important because they challenge all of us to be ready for the time when we have run the race. We shall be subjected to a time of evaluation of the impact of what we did and how we do it, especially in times like this. Number two, I want to also reinstate the fact that freedom, especially academic freedom, is very key. Because it's only with those and such conversations that we are able to actually learn and stop whitewashing what would have been good learning moments for all of us. Because there is no doubt in my mind that those who are listening to us today are going to go on to become very important players in the constitutional development and constitutional conversations, not just of Uganda, but clearly of East Africa and world beyond. And therefore, they need to hear, as we have heard, about the challenges that come with leadership. And so we thank you for, probably it's easier for you because this is what you've done for over 30 years, but really for being able to unpack this great leader, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere for us. I have just one or two points that I would like to cause for reflection, and I know some of our students are seated here, and we have used rather dictatorial ways to ensure that they come to attend this class. But we hold no apologies because I think it was important for them to come and listen to you today. I won't disclose whose idea was which one in ensuring that they came, but maybe that also brings out the point that sometimes probably a leader sees something, but the people have not yet seen it. And maybe the leader then does all in their power to ensure that the people go in a certain direction. To what extent, therefore, when we talk about not just the constitution, but constitutionalism, did the people of Tanzania participate in determining the constitutional order of the time? Because one of my working definitions of constitutionalism is it being a compound of ideas, but also attitudes and patterns of behavior. And so, Honorable, my question to you would then be, were there any patterns of behavior that you identified which elaborated that the people of Tanzania were in support of what Julius Nyerere was doing at the time? Of course, this is about elaborating the principle that the authority of government derives from and is limited by a body of fundamental law. Some of the decisions we think about, one of them being what happened when Idi Amin, as we hear, decided to annex the Kagera territory of Tanzania and therefore elicited the reaction that he received. Yes, Nyerere did not only repulse him, but also went again further to visit Masaka, Mbarara, and other places in Uganda, and to do the things that you have talked about. To what extent did the people participate? Number two that I would like to ask is the times. I know it is Charles Dickens in his book A Tale of Two Cities, where he starts by saying it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was a time like no other, but it was a time like any other time. And it got me thinking, in the times that Nyerere was operating, when we see him taking certain decisions, first of all, I would like to believe this was the time of the Cold War, or shortly thereafter. This was the time when Tanzania was recovering from the Maji Maji rebellion and the fight for independence. And it was a time of stabilizing what I would call the post-colonial independent state. I would like to believe that there are certain decisions that had to be taken. Some decisions were probably not totally democratic, but hopefully Tanzania, in one way or another, could have benefited. Do you think any leader in that time applying the things we teach about in the university, constitutionalism, democracy, do things the proper way, have a plebiscite, a referendum to decide whether to do what you need to do. Do you think Tanzania at that time would have benefited from that kind of methodology? Or is there room for us to excuse Nyerere? And this is said from a person who has been an erstwhile supporter of Mwalimu. And I just want to know whether that is something we could think about. And I said this, as you mentioned in your paper, regarding the specific times when Tanzania now comes up as a leader of the frontline states that were using undemocratic, unconstitutional, military means to support those frontline states in their push for independence. I guess what I'm asking, can we excuse him because of the times? Number three is a point of reflection for me. And those of you who know, you always hear me talk about my book. And in that book, we don't teach that at the university. I reflect on the place of mentorship. And from your conversation, Honorable, I can clearly see that many leaders followed and were mentored by Julius Nyerere. And I would like to ask whether the mentorship was correct or wrong. What has happened today? In your opinion as a political leader, to what extent do you see mentorship playing a role in helping young people, erstwhile politicians, to become the politicians that are necessary for the 21st century and beyond? I take a lot of exception to some of the political leaders we have today. And of course the question is, what is Unaweza doing about it? I am doing something about it right now. Have we lost out on mentorship? Because I can see from your story, everything that President Museveni, for example, has done can in one way or another be attributed to the mentorship that he received from President Nyerere. Is there, for example, in Tanzania, serious mentorship taking place? For example, I heard a story that former President Jakaya Kikwete was interested in becoming president. And the story we hear is that Julius Nyerere called him aside and said, he referred to him as a young man and said, young man, allow the likes of, what was the, Mukapa, and there was another one. Allow them to, Ali Hassan Mwinyi, allow them to do their part. Let them serve and go. Your time is coming. I don't know how far true that story is, but I think it's a good story, hopefully, if it is true, to begin our own reflection. In the fight for constitutionalism, in the fight for upholding the rule of law and good governance, to what extent has there been support from the elderly, those who've been there to help our people who want to become leaders? Lastly, you mentioned something regarding the financial legacy of Julius Nyerere's family, or his family as a result of his legacy. And I think if I heard you correctly, you said his pension came a whole year after, and you know, he probably did not die a wealthy billionaire. My question is, in our day today, where no longer do we see the state as the leader of the market, where we see a lot of challenges regarding how the state is governed, and in the words of General Otafire, when he came to speak many years ago here on corruption, he said we're in a stage of primitive accumulation of wealth. Could you comment on what can be done? Because, you know, I once heard from somewhere else the comment that, you know, first of all, as lawyers, you are supposed to be wealthy. But you and I know that wealth, like the fight for academic freedom, grows slowly. But we are teaching a growing group of very impatient young people. They don't want to drive what Unaweza is driving in 10 years' time. They want to drive that Mercedes Benz today, if possible, before the end of 4th year. And that for me is important. So in the broader scheme of things, the people who are supposed to lead all these conversations on good governance, the fight for corruption, and so on and so forth, are also impatient to resolve the financial question. Maybe you could comment on that. What, in your view, do you think would be the way forward? Lastly, I would like everyone here to stand and celebrate you, especially for the great sacrifice of those 16 bullets. If you would kindly
let us keep our questions short so that we're able to engage better with Honorable.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, my friend Anna Reisman. It's a pleasure to meeting you. I was once a postgraduate training intern at Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and that's where I happened to first of all have met your first book, Mr. Tundu Lissu. I read it from CAS offices. My name is Musana Jafari, the National Mobilization Secretary of the newly formed political party called RPP, Revolutionary People's Party. And I'm a Makererian. We are talking about Museveni having gone to where? To Tanzania. And, you know, he was well relinquished with knowledge and information. And he came. My question is, where did President Museveni throw the notes that he learned from Tanzania? Because Mwalimu Julius Nyerere taught him all those things, you understand? For instance, peaceful, living power peacefully. Mwalimu did that. So where did Museveni leave the notes of living power peacefully? Then number two, John Locke, he wrote a book, The Second Treatise of Government. We were looking, or we are talking about the interaction between law and politics. And that's where I'm going. John Locke talked about a legitimate government, whereby you have to use the law.
Hello, I'm sorry to interrupt, but let
now
us
next
keep the
time I kindly ask, because this is an intellectual debate. Next time you have to upbraid us. Thank you.
Once again, one question per person and get straight to it.
Oh, thank you so much, Honorable Tundu Lissu. It has been an insightful discussion, and I have a question I'm going to summarize. We have heard of Julius Nyerere. We have heard of the good stories about him. But what has hindered the information that we have heard from Honorable Tundu Lissu? What has hindered the masses from speaking evil or ill about him, that they want to prioritize him to be a saint? And if you look at leadership, don't you think that leadership may have some loopholes, that it won't be a smooth sail? And you talked about Honorable Julius Nyerere inspiring Museveni into the dictatorship. We are looking at something that was done by a neighbor. I'm failing to pay school fees for my children, and my children are not studying, and I'm saying that it's because of the neighbor that my kids are not studying. I am blaming my consequences. I'm blaming my effects, my atrocities to someone else. I feel like it's more of a decision one decides to make for them to achieve or reap what they may want to achieve. And you talked about a university being a safe space for us to speak about these things. And actually, it doesn't make sense for us speaking of these things when we are at the university and we don't put them into practicability when we get out. It's like I'm studying to preserve it for the studies, and I'm not going to apply it anywhere. So thank you so much, and those are the few questions I had. Thank you. Allow me to submit.
Thank you so much. My name is King Praise Apology. My question is a bit long, but I'm going to try and summarize it. I will just start with something that I felt kept recurring when Honorable was speaking, and it's something I got to learn about a few weeks ago, and it's that all authoritarians have a playbook, and from that playbook, they pick from each other. And right now we see that Nyerere was a mentor to Museveni and a lot of the policies that Museveni has today. He drew a gruesome picture of how bad the picture can get. And what stopped Nyerere was the fact that he was able to step down from power and say, okay, here is this peaceful transition and I'm giving it to you. But that's not the case for Uganda today, right? we have not been granted that peaceful transition, and there is someone who has gone even above and beyond what their mentor gave them. And the question then becomes, what do we do as young people who realize that we are in a place like this? And my thought has always been that it's for us to acknowledge that we are now under a dictatorship, and what is needed is a revolution of sorts. When George stood up and spoke, he spoke about how there is something happening about no reform, no election. And I would like to speak to the 2026 election. I've been tweeting a lot about this, and I felt now is an opportunity to talk about it. I ask again, given what is happening in Kawempe, which is just a by-election, people being abducted, people being killed, people being beaten and shot at, what is the efficacy of elections in such a system when they have existed for all the years that they have and they haven't yielded anything for us? What is the place for reform? Dr. Reza talks about a certain justification. Is there some room for justification of authoritarianism? And he says it could be justified if this leader has a good intention, but I don't think so, because democracy is the lesser evil, right? And from the context of a democracy, power is derived from the people, it's gotten from the people and given to this one leader. So it's easier to sensitize the masses to accept an idea than to force the people to accept the idea. But now when it comes to a point like this, where elections have failed to work for us in Uganda, what do we do? What's the revolutionary alternative? The question cuts across to whoever is on the bench. But I would like to say that it starts in small ways that we can. Not all of us can go to the street and protest, but we are having an election period within this university. Tell me why you would vote someone who affiliates themselves with all the evils that the NRM has created in this country. Tell me why you would vote someone in your school as a GRC without a total understanding of their manifesto, but just because they're your friends or they have given you a little bread. I see some people putting on tags for different people because they are running for different offices. When someone stops you and says, vote for me in this position, do you even ask them what their manifesto is? Do you ask them what their opinion is about the political issues in this country?
Praise.
In conclusion, I feel it's important for us to be honest with ourselves, basing on the story that
there is a question this side.
Thank you very much. I'll keep my question short. My name is Aishuka Alan, and I'm a fourth-year law student. I'm also a Secretary General of Africa Poetry Students Organization. It's a regional-based organization. I say that because we've been moving out there into institutions of learning, preaching about the legacy of Nyerere. And it seems my mind has just been sanitized of the excessiveness in which I've been preaching the good man. I now understand that we have to be critical at some stage. My concern is about the Nyerereism that continues to flow around the region. We are soon launching an Africa Poetry chapter in Tanzania, a few months from now. But our concern is East African Federation. We are seeing what is happening in Congo. It mirrors exactly what happened in Uganda in the 1980s. The strategy that M23 takes in, taking on a few parts in different stages mirrors what happened here in Uganda. Do we have hope that this kind of mentorship that has neighbors enter the spaces of neighbors and destabilize neighbors, does it give us hope for the unity of East Africa? Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. Mheshimiwa shikamoo. Naitwa Douglas Guti kutoka Temeke, Dar es Salaam. Douglas Guti kutoka Temeke. Guti. Yeah. Mheshimiwa, my question to you is, in the quest to recover from the authoritarian rule of Julius Nyerere as it was, I feel you as the chairperson of Chadema congratulations upon being elected. But Chadema has failed the people of Tanzania. In 2015, Mheshimiwa, you very well know that Edward Lowassa, who was the former Prime Minister of Tanzania and a proud member of CCM, was given the card of Chadema to represent it on the presidential elections. President Magufuli, may his soul rest in eternal peace, won that peace. However, there was a contestation. And when you came to stand for presidency in 2020, Mheshimiwa, President Magufuli won with 84.4%, a win that was unprecedented and one that has never happened before. So don't we think, Mheshimiwa, that Chadema has failed the people of Dar es Salaam, and there has not been enough work that has been done to support the people of Dar es Salaam in the quest for democracy? Thank you.
We're going to have a very last question. Please keep it under 2 minutes.
Okay. I'm Semalash Arsenyanjo, law student here at Makerere. My question is, as you've been speaking about Mwalimu Julius Nyerere as a Pan-Africanist, we know that he was a member of the Monrovia group, not the Casablanca group. I would like you to throw some light about it. Why did he choose the Monrovia group that wanted progressive unity rather than the Casablanca group that wanted unity there and then, and yet in his own nation, Tanzania, he preached unity and even practiced it in a way that was violent and in a way that was, for me, it's justifiable. I think when he came to Uganda in 1979, he had to take over Uganda in order to unite it with Tanzania. Would have had, at least unit of Africa would have started from there to spread all over the continent. Thank you.
I've been informed we've been given 5 more minutes, so please keep it short to give other people an opportunity to ask questions.
Hello?
Okay, so we shall have you and then someone at the back there. Then Jibril, you'll go last.
Thank you very much, moderator. Okay, I'm Ilem Rodney. I'm a master's student at Makerere University doing political science or doing public administration. They always say that a billion people being full doesn't make anything true. It makes a billion fools. What we call mentorship could be what we consider in political science as false consciousness. So, can we literally say that Museveni is being inspired by this false consciousness of authoritarianism, yet in the context of the 21st century, is being labeled as an authoritarian? That's number one. Number two, talk about Nyerere. I think there's also something to deal with the ideology that brought them up. Doing political science, we realize that there are some political philosophies that have been taken up by most of these political leaders. Socialism is one of them, Pan-Africanism, and communism that Nyerere wanted to create. Through his Ojama policy that some people say that it failed totally. What do you consider? Because with this Marxism, the fight for the proletariats, the fight for socialism, the dictatorial governments, do you see it as something that we can always still cherish up to now, or we can definitely just abandon such ideas? Lastly, talking about this whole situation, I feel like how do we now associate with such people at this moment, knowing clearly that to some extent their political ideas, their mentorship and all that has just been a fabrication? Yes? And how do we really relate with this information at this moment? Are they still relevant for us? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Unlike the large population that is here, I'm not a student of Makerere University. My name is Bangana Mohsin, a student of Victoria University. Putting that into consideration, I would like to go a little controversial from whatever is discussing at the moment. My question, therefore, as we are on the subject of democracy, my question to you, Honorable, is don't you think as the African continent we have been sold the wrong idea of what democracy is? Don't you think we have also been sold with the wrong idea that by changing presidents we'll be able to have a better economy, we'll be able to have a better all these things? How about if I would pose a question? Who among us, the Western sold us the ideas that China, Russia are bad countries. Who among the Ugandan population would be given a visa to stay in Russia and would say, I would rather stay in Uganda? Or who among us would be given a visa to stay in China and say, I would rather stay in Uganda? The Western sold us these ideas that these countries are not democratic, these countries are authoritarian, so they want us to also believe that we should go that way. Look at the histories of how their Western countries were made. For example, look at the British Empire, how it came to be a superpower the way it is. It is because they had an authoritarian system that built them to the stage where they are, and now they can't afford democracy. We can't afford democracy where we are right now. There should be a strong arm that should put us there. Thank you very much.
Okay, my name is Jibril Sekandi, and I'm a year one student, School of Law here. I have like 3 things. Firstly, I would submit that, like anyone or most of the people, the problem that most of Africans or people have is not the time that presidents stay in power, but the kind of services that people give during their time of service. We wouldn't cry over the president of Uganda if he had been a very good man. But that throws me to what I wanted to submit on, that I think that in my opinion, our constitution, in the way it's framed or its nature, the president was awake when everyone was asleep. What do I mean? That by the nature of powers given to him by the constitution and the checks, it seems as though that it created like a dictatorship already. Because you can't put me in power and give me power to get people to check that power. I think that's a blunder in our constitution. And also, conclusively, our university seems to be an extension of the president's dining room. As everything that is happening here isn't any different from what the president would want. I submit.
So I've been informed of 2 insistent hands from the beginning. I started asking questions. So, but I'm only allowing you to speak on agreement that you ask 1 question. Okay. Can we have him and the gentleman at the back? Those are the 2. 1 question, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Nathan Biamukama, and I was a year ahead of Honorable Dar es Salaam. Probably you still remember me or you don't, but what I can tell the rest here, he was a very prison suits. So he was active in politics. So when those ones were, I saw some people here trying to vie for office, you must consult him. He was very active politically. Unfortunately, I entered when you had spoken, but I also know that you spoke on a subject probably which you understand very well. Having been taught by Issa Shiviji, and I know you are a very good friend. Issa has just written a book on Nyerere, the biography. I don't know the extent which you have referred to that book, but it is Development as Rebellion. No? Yeah, Development as Rebellion. Very interesting, where he analyzes Nyerere from the beginning up to end, together with the Kamata and Osman. I have read it. And I was trying to figure out exactly the dictatorial part of it that you could have pointed out, which I missed. I would have loved to know that. But in those stories, and I know you know very well that Issa Seviji was a very big critic of Mwalimu Nyerere, but a very big supporter of Mwalimu Nyerere as well.
Please, could we wrap it up?
So the point I'm making is, first, probably the extent to which you referred to that. Secondly, that I think also, you being a leader, a student leader, Museveni himself having been a student leader, probably you have a lot to share. Because one of the examples that the Issa points out from that book is that he even could get students in 1966, I think, killing them, giving them chiboko at State House, sending them home, but returning again, bringing them back, and even appointing them positions of responsibility when they have completed school. Now, whether that is dictatorship or discipline, I don't know. But thank you very much, and I'm happy to see you again, as smart as you were at that time.
Thank you. Please. No, it's this gentleman here. That's the last question.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Maige. I'm Tanzanian. Let me declare my interest. A student here at Makerere, pursuing my master's in peace and conflict studies at CHUS. Welcome, Your Excellency, Mr. Chairperson, Tundu and Lissu. I have one question to you. You are judging Mwalimu Nyerere as a dictator who managed to create a nation from more than 120 tribes, and also he refused to mine minerals until the Tanzanian get education and knowledge, who participated in liberation of all of frontline struggle across Africa, a president who didn't even want to buy a car for himself. Now you are saying his regime was the dictatorial regime. I would like to ask you a question. Don't you think this speech you are making here demoralizes young generation toward struggles for good governance and patriotism? Thank you. I submit.
If you promise to keep it in one minute.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm Charles. I have a question to Honorable Tundu Lissu, who is actually president in the making, and this is very important. You talked about the militarization of politics and the politicization of the armed forces. I think this is a monster which is eating up Africa in its entirety. So as a possible president, what is your take on this trend of militarizing politics and politicizing armed forces? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know we still have a lot more questions, but unfortunately, time is not on our side. Allow me to cheat protocol, Honorable, and ask a question, and this is very relevant to student leadership. I noticed that as you were speaking, you did not exactly tell us about your time in university, what political offices you got into, because that's a very important conversation. When, yeah, so would like to know. So I would like to know from you whether the whole student politics is relevant to the grander struggle out there. Is it relevant, or are we wasting time?
Well, thank you very much for very good questions. I have recorded 14 questions from you, I'm not sure I can answer them all in 10 minutes that I have. But let me try. Starting with the very last one about student politics. Student politics are the incubators, if you will, for politics out of here, out of the university. And therefore, by all means, you should take the politics of the university absolutely seriously. Mwalimu, just, you know, the 2 or so hours that we have spent here, if there is one thing they have shown is Mwalimu was a very complex character. Mwalimu was a very complex political figure. I think it is important to understand that complexity. The attempts to put him on a pedestal, the attempts to canonize him, whether as a secular saint or a religious one, are attempts to dehumanize Mwalimu. What we should do and what we should make sure we do is to humanize Mwalimu Nyerere. A great man, absolutely, but a man all the same. A fallible man. He never was. He never was, and he could never be a saint. And so for my 20 cents, I have tried to show that Mwalimu was human after all. He committed some very fundamental mistakes. There are stories that we cannot tell because of the shortage of time that may actually lead to us questioning some of his motives, because it is always told that the intentions were good. His intentions were honorable. But you should remember, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. He was a man, and a very complex man. His legacy continues to torment us, and I underline that, torment. The way our leaders are behaving today, these completely unaccountable and criminal behavior on the part of our leaders, has everything to do with the constitutional foundations that were laid by Mwalimu back in 1962, which created a president who was only accountable to his God. And therefore, how good was that? How good could that be? Mwalimu created a nation out of 120 tribes. I would say he created a very powerful state. Now, I'm not very sure whether a state is the same thing as a nation. We still have our 120 tribes. We still do. We were not fighting amongst ourselves in the 80 years that we were under colonialism. We have not fought amongst ourselves in the 64 years that we have been independent. that we have been, the post-colonial stability in Tanzania originates with the German colonialism. I think that is very important to point out. All right? Secondly, it is important to underline a very important fact that in Mwalimu's state, if you examine it closely, actually you see a striking continuity between the colonial state and the post-colonial state. For example, the hallmark of the colonial state was the all-powerful figure of the colonial governor. How are the colonial governor's powers compared to the powers of the post-colonial presidents? The hallmark of the colonial state was its violent, oppressive character, characterized by a regime of rightless law and administrative fiat, characterized by the violence, state-orchestrated violence of the instruments of violence of colonial state, the police, the army, the prisons, the courts. How do they differ with today's state, whether in Uganda or Tanzania? And then there are some of the most obvious features, relics of colonialism. How do you call your district bosses here? You call them RDCs, yeah? Resident District Commissioners. Ausio. How did the British colonial state call them prior to 1962? District Commissioners. Your RDCs have powers, police powers. They can arrest you. They can detain you, right? Where did they get those powers from? From the district commissioners of the British colonialism. And you see the same thing in Tanzania. All right? So, that continuity between colonialism and post-colonialism, it must be emphasized. All right? And we often think that, you know, the colonial state that we inherited at independence was unproblematic. It was deeply problematic because it was created for one purpose, to extract wealth from the colonized. It was not an instrument to protect you. It was an instrument to oppress you in order to exploit you for the benefit of where the colonialists had come from. How has it changed post-colonial, post-61 or 62? How has the nature of the Ugandan state different today from what it was prior to 1962? And these are questions that we always have to interrogate. What about ideologies and political philosophies? Mwalimu was a professed socialist. He wasn't a Marxist-Leninist like Mugabe, all right? He wasn't a Marxist-Leninist like Samora Machel, some of his political children. He was a Fabian socialist. He was a socialist of the social democratic type, the Western social democratic type. Kenyatta never had anything to do with socialism. Felix Houphouët-Boigny in Cote d'Ivoire, any other African head of state, Mobutu Sese Seko, they were not socialists. They have one thing in common with socialists like Mwalimu: the authoritarian and unaccountable power that they held over their people and their societies. And therefore, speaking strictly of of African leaders of the post-colonial period, the one thing that unites them all is their authoritarianism, not their political or ideological courts they were at one time or another. What they have in common is the oppression of their people. All right? Mwalimu Nyerere, we will perhaps never know, but hundreds, possibly thousands, were detained without trial in his 24 years of office as president. Detention without trial. Even the British colonial state, in its all oppressiveness, never had preventive detention law. That is a creation of independent Tanganyika. Mwalimu borrowed it from Ghana's Nkrumah. Was a preventive detention law was first enacted on the African continent by Kwame Nkrumah in 1960. In 1962, Mwalimu copied it almost word for word from Nkrumah's Ghana. The British never had it, you know? And you cannot say that the colonial state was democratic by any yardstick. It wasn't. But there are certain respects in which the post-colonial state has been even more oppressive of the people than the colonial state ever was. Since we are in Uganda, you remember the 90 days removal order for Ugandan Asians in 1972? Huh? You remember? Ausio? Eh? What happened in Tanzania in April of 1971? Under the cover of darkness, and when I say under the cover of darkness, I mean there was absolutely no debate. A law was rushed through Parliament, through the Parliament of Tanzania, under certificate of urgency. It was passed the same day, I think April 20th, 1971. Under that law, the government of Tanzania expropriated the real property, buildings of anyone whose building was valued at 100,000 shillings at that time, roughly around 20,000 pounds, and so on. 90% of them were Asians, were Tanzanian Asians. Within a year, almost 75% of Asians had left the country, penniless. A year later, when Idi Amin and they were given 90 days to leave, where did they go? Some tried to cross the border to Tanzania. They were prevented from getting into Tanzania. They ended up in Sussex in the UK, cities like Leicester and other British cities and in Canada. So there are things that should make us wonder when we talk of these great men such as Mwalimu. What should I say? What else? What else? And how many minutes do I have? Let's hope I come back to Uganda. I don't have to wait another 11 years to come back here to talk again with the Ugandan students. I will say one thing that we have not mentioned at all: Mwalimu's foreign policy. I think if there is one thing that Mwalimu did us proud, was his progressive foreign policy. His progressive foreign policy. Mwalimu had a position and his position was always based on principle and moral high ground. Mwalimu, had he been around today, Mwalimu will definitely have something to say about the genocide in Gaza. I have not heard a single head of state, except Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa, taking a position about the tens of thousands of Gaza residents who have been massacred by.
Here is a lesson too. Konrad Adenauer was also a man of his time. Konrad Adenauer has left us with great legacies that we as Konrad Adenauer Stiftung live in our work and like to be associated with. But once again, he was born in 1876. He came and took over the chancellorship in Germany in 1949, being quite an old man by then. And definitely he was a leader who would not only take very popular decisions. Some of his decisions went in contrary to the popular opinion. So yes, the role of the leader is not just to take popular decisions, and sometimes it is also to take decisions that the majority would not in that moment align with. That is the truth about being a leader. And he himself always was saying that power corrupts, and he was not excluding himself. So this is for me also always very important to say when I represent an institution that bears a name of a politician. That's number one. Number two, as I represent again here the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, I would like to read from what our mission statement says, and only a part of it. Through our work, we contribute towards securing and increasing peace, freedom and prosperity in Europe and throughout the world. We stand for personal responsibility, justice, and solidarity. We are firmly committed to liberal representative democracy, the rule of law, the social market economy, and European unification. We are guided by the Christian view of humanity. And if I turn around and read what the mission of Europec is, it is to promote respect for universal human rights, and we also have this in our mission statement, peace, you have heard it, democratic values, and the rule of law through teaching, action-oriented, and strategic research and outreach. And in our mission statement, we also talk about through which means we promote what we stand for. Why do I say this? Because I want to underline that this mission of ours, shaping democracy together, only works if we find partners with whom we can do it together. And this decision is always based whether we find partners in whom we find like-minded people. It does not mean that we need to align in everything and anything, but it does mean that we have certain ideas and certain visions in common. Nowadays, in many countries, partners who work with organizations from the West are called foreign agents. And sometimes my impression is that this term is being used very selectively, because we work with many different organizations, institutions, governments, political parties, civil society actors, academia representatives, from the private sector. And yet, this term is used only for a certain group among them. It is on you to judge and to observe for which one. But it is important for us as a Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, who we stand for democracy, that we do work with the pluralistic society that is reflected and represented in different sectors of the society and, of course, politics as well. And we take pride in having a very diverse landscape of actors in Uganda, but also all over the world. And my third point is just to thank you. Thank you very much, Madam President, for moderating this session. It has not been an easy exercise. We could see all the hands behind us from where I was sitting, and that only shows the interest in such debates and the importance to open up this space for such conversations. And therefore, thank you very much once again to Europec for allowing this, to the School of Law and to the Makerere University, which is one of our partners at Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and we are always very happy to come back to the Makerere University and to work together with different entities at the Makerere universities to open up spaces for critical debate and exchange. Again, thank you very much. And of course, last but not least, Honorable Lissu, dear Tundu, thank you very much for agreeing to stay a bit longer in Uganda, pretty much just for this talk, just to be at the university and talk to the students. With this, Dr. Unaweza and Dr. Kabumba, once again, thank you for hosting us, and it was a pleasure and an honor for us to be here. Thank you.
Yes, we have come to the end of our public lecture and engagement today. Thank you so much for coming. Anna, you mentioned that you can see the enthusiasm that the student community has in such issues, and as I was sitting, I had an idea of a moot court competition on constitutionalism for the students, or something to do with academic writing. I don't know if the students would be open to that partnership with Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Are you open to that? Yes, okay. So, yes, so we're going to have a group photo. I've been guided, we're going to have a group photo from here. So, move down. Okay, so we're going to come to you, the panelists. We're going to stand there, then they'll take the photo.